This is Jonathan Kaiman. He was, as you see on screen, the head of the Los Angeles Times Beijing Bureau. However, he also drank a lot of alcohol and had several peculiar sexual experiences in peculiar places, and some accounts of that got written about on the internet, and of course, there was some word of mouth about him. Now, a journalist named Emily Yoffee, way back in October of 2019, wrote an article presenting this guy as a kind of super victim. As it says here, quote, he is one of the least famous, least powerful men on the lists published by the New York Times and Bloomberg of those who have lost their jobs in the wake of the hashtag MeToo movement. And she makes the argument that this somehow reflects a tendency towards mob justice, and as you see here on screen, comparing it to hysteria about Satanism, McCarthyism, false memories. Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch. And the fact is, it's getting harder and harder to be a bad journalist in the 21st century because all of the sources she worked from are available for us to see on the internet. Here is the original account from Laura Tucker, which I mentioned repeatedly in the video. There's a link to it below the description. Here's the retort from Felicia Sonmez. And although the original article was back in October 2019, I believe this is so much talked about today. So many people are reading and responding to the article because it was just a few days ago now in August 25th, 2019, that Felicia Sonmez really challenged the accuracy of the journalist's work. Let's just say, hypothetically, someone wrote an autobiographical account on the internet of someone else's bad behavior. Let's say no laws were broken. Let's just say it's someone who got drunk and acted in a manner that was shameful. And let's just suppose this account was completely truthful. But because this account was written, somebody lost their job. Someone's whole life got turned inside out. They lost their job, they lost their home, they had to move to another place, they lost their book deal. I really want to challenge you. Does that mean that the first person was wrong to write that autobiographical account? We have to make hard decisions about freedom of speech in the 21st century. I have a ton of respect for Laura Tucker. Laura Tucker is a woman who was living in Beijing, and she wrote a completely reasonable account of her bad experience with a journalist called John Kaiman, sometimes given as Jonathan Kaiman, naturally. The one thing you could never legislate is reasonableness. You can never write a law that says, you know what, we're going to give you freedom of speech, but be reasonable. You know what, freedom of speech, it's not for everybody, it's only for the reasonable people. You can never do that. If you allow people freedom of speech, some are going to use it in an unreasonable way. But Laura Tucker, link below this video, she wrote a completely reasonable account of her sexual experience with this guy, John Kaiman. She does not leap to any unreasonable allegations or accusations. She does not, for example, this is something very common in the 21st century, she does not leap to the conclusion that this guy has a psychological problem. She does not diagnose him and say that he's a narcissist. She does not say that he's a sociopath. She does not say she's a psychopath. She does not do anything like that. She has a reasonable set of reflections on this thing that happened in her life and what it meant for her. She reflects on her own shortcomings and her own feelings, and she reflects on the guy's shortcomings as well. If she does not have the freedom of speech to write this, then I don't have the freedom of speech to write my own autobiography, and neither do you or you or you in the audience. All right, let's face up to that. I think it's important to discipline this sort of discussion about freedom of speech by asking hypothetically, what law would this have broken? What law could this have broken? Do you see what I'm saying? Not just referring to the laws as they actually exist today, but if we think this is morally wrong, how would we legislate against it? What would be the limit to be imposed on it? So I see absolutely nothing wrong in the conduct of Laura Tucker here. You can click on the link below this video. I see something here that's really important to praise. because there are so many examples of this kind of controversy that begin with someone pointing the finger and calling somebody a psychopath and a sociopath and making, criminal allegations that are unwarranted and so on, going way, way beyond what this account does. Now, the problem is, and the reason why this is a controversy today, is that Emily Yoffee took this story and wrote a very bombastic, very one-sided, and frankly misleading article about it on a website called reason.com. So Emily Yoffee characterizes her own motivation. She says, quote, "My story is about the dangers of moral panics and of applying mob justice and the bazooka of social media to private relations." Here meaning private sexual relationships. If that was her interest, she really chose a very, very poor case study. And there's a rebuttal, I'll give the link in the description again, from Felicia Sonmez. The fundamental question here is, can you judge the act by its consequences? Two different women tell the true story of their sexual relationship, their sexual experience with this guy. Because they tell their story, a couple other witnesses apparently came forward for other sorts of examples of drunken bad behavior on this guy's part. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about rape. We're not talking about outright simple crimes. But the guy evidently had a lot of drunken bad behavior. And his employer carried out an investigation and pulled these things together. It wasn't mob justice. It wasn't an overnight decision. Felicia sits down. She tells you exactly how many months the investigation went on for and so on. And the employer decided, we don't want you. Okay? Now, I don't know. I don't know if he had a contract, had a morals clause in it. I don't know, exactly what the basis is. I don't know if some of the examples of his drunken misconduct or some of the examples of his sexual misconduct were with coworkers or at office functions or parties. I don't know in that sense technically what the justification was. But there are big unanswered questions here for how the internet is going to transform human behavior. Okay? It is now true as never before. If you go out and get drunk and get stoned, you can end up getting fired for it.
Number 7, and this rule is so underrated. Gotta lead them, drugs alone can't be on point when you faded.
This kind of just generally immoral, desultory behavior, disreputable, immature behavior. It's possible now for an employer to look at that, and it may be on videotape on the internet, and it may be that people are writing into your employer and describing what happened at the nightclub. One of these events is at a karaoke bar and this kind of stuff. And the employer is going to look at that and say, well, this is not who we want representing our office. This is not who we want filling this role. This really shows that this person has poor judgment or is very immature or very unreliable. I think that's the real story here, and those are the real questions. So this journalist, Emily Yoffee, tried to take the story and really turn it upside down. But nobody claims that he's innocent, right? That's what's interesting about this. Nobody is making false allegations. Both these women seem to have been very, very reasonable. Felicia Sonmez and Laura Tucker. They were both reasonable. They didn't make unreasonable allegations or accusations. And then secondly, nobody claims this guy is innocent. The version of events given by Jonathan Kaiman, it basically only differs from the accounts of these women in terms of how he felt about things or what he intended to say, in terms of what happened where and when, in terms of his actual, again, drunken misconduct and sexual misconduct, whatever you want to say, his bad behavior. There's no real disagreement here, all right? The disagreement is about whether or not behavior like this, going from the private sphere to the public sphere on the internet, going from being something unknown to something known, what is the morality of somebody making the decision to take that private experience and put it on the internet. And it is very fundamentally the same freedom that we have in writing our own autobiography. Say, hey, this was my experience. This is what happened to me. And then you know what? Your employer can read it, and members of the general public can read it too. You know, my mother was urging me just a couple weeks ago. I was talking to my mother, and my mother was saying to me, you know, you have so many interesting stories. You've got to write a memoir. You've got to write an autobiography or a series of books that are autobiographical. And I mean, the irony is, if I wrote an autobiography, it would hurt a lot of people's feelings. Above all else, it would probably hurt my own mother's feelings. My own mother would probably be one of the people the most hurt, the most negatively impacted, if I were to now write an autobiography. Does freedom of speech include the right to tell the truth, even if other people get hurt, even if other people get fired? I think the terrifying reality we all live with in the 21st century is that we know that it does. We know that it must. We know that freedom of speech would mean nothing if we can't tell the truth and hurt other people's feelings, can't tell the truth and get other people fired. But in this case, I think the journalists got it 100% wrong, because both of these women, Laura Tucker and Felicia Summers, deserve a lot of credit for being reasonable. The challenge of the 21st century is precisely that we give people freedoms with the knowledge that a great many of them are going to make unreasonable use of those freedoms with long-term consequences that they can never really take responsibility for.